Hello everyone, it's time. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 came out. I made my video. I've generally, as much as I can within, a month or so of the game coming out, I've kind of settled on what the title was for me. And I think it's time for us to add Xenoblade Chronicles 3 to our ranking list. So this is something, if you weren't here for the initial list, I did a whole hour-and-a-half podcast where I went through and talked about each game and ranked them on this list. So if you're curious about how we ended up with what we got right here, there's a video about that. I will say, Xenosaga Episode 3 fans, I was too harsh in that video. I think the language I used was not particularly productive language, so I apologize for that. I wanted to do two things today, though. One is we'll be adding Xenoblade Chronicles 3 to this list. And two, when I was making the Xenoblade Chronicles 3 video, I had to play some of these games again just to get some footage, and I wanted to kind of make sure my thinking was right on certain games and make sure, how I felt about them and how I felt about certain mechanics of them were accurate. So I went back and played those. And so in revisiting those, some of these games I hadn't touched since, 2008 or something like that, right? Replaying those, I kind of got to revisit those games to some extent. I did not revisit them in their entirety, just to kind of touch around, and I'll let you know as we go through each of these. So I may shift some things around for that reason. Also, I generally am just a very fickle person when it comes to rankings. If you don't know, when I rank Final Fantasy games, they move a lot on my list. Especially my favorite Final Fantasy is always changing, it feels like. Nothing particularly changes between that time other than time passed, and I feel different ways at different times of my life, kind of thing. So I was going to go through these again real quick, just kind of review these. I did have to add on some additional ones at the bottom that were missing last time, but I'm not going to really touch on any of those. We're just going to look at the ones that I actually ranked. Anything that's below the line outside of Xenoblade Chronicles 3, I have just not played yet, or not played significantly enough that I feel like I can add it to this list. So I'm starting at the bottom here, though. Xenosaga Episode 3. If you were listening last time, I'm pretty negative on this game. I do not like a lot of its, I can't really say that much about its world design aspect. I will say, I think when it comes to pre-Xenoblade games, dungeon design is particularly important, and I'll be honest with you, I cannot really remember how Xenosaga Episode 3 was, and in playing, in revisiting it, I did not really see anything that really jumped out at me that I was like, oh yeah, this is, something that really stood out about that to me. What I can say, though, about Xenosaga Episode 3 is that I feel like the combat presentation is really top quality, even if I don't like what the combat's doing. I think the mech animations and the character animations are all probably the flashiest they ever were in the series, and I can at least appreciate that. However, for now, it does not move off our F list without me replaying the whole game, probably. So, Project Crosszone, played a little bit of that again. Same deal in revisiting it. I just think it's a really slow game, and while there's nice things about this combat system, I think the overall pacing of the game really kills the momentum, and the simplification of the combat system compared to something like Endless Frontier, I think really hurts it in a lot of ways. So, that's going to remain in the D spot. Xenogears, same deal. I don't really have anything to say about that. I did not play it. Disaster Day of Crisis, staying at the C rank. Did not touch that for this video either. Xenoblade Chronicles X, I did not touch for this video. But in doing the video, I had to think a lot about Xenoblade Chronicles X. And I think after kind of mulling on it a bit, I kind of respect Xenoblade Chronicles X a bit more. I think what I probably said last time, I did not revisit that video, but what I think I probably said last time was something along the lines of, the combat was a little too similar to the original Xenoblade Chronicles, but the world design was really good overall. And there are a lot of problems with Xenoblade Chronicles X, I will say. However, in thinking about it, I think the overdrive system on this game is really cool. The soul voice system is really cool. And so while the combat's definitely based in Xenoblade Chronicles 1, I think it does a lot to kind of set itself apart. So I would definitely prefer something that's a little more distinct from Xenoblade Chronicles 1, but I think it's still pretty strong. And I think in thinking about this, I will probably move Xenoblade Chronicles X. Let's do it to here right now. So if you don't know, these are going from left to right, so the left is the better of the B's kind of thing. I may change that positioning here in a little bit when we talk about Baten Kaitos Origins, but I wanted to move that over there. I think that's appropriate. Endless Frontier, I played a little bit of that. I think that game's still really cool. I think what that game does is, I mentioned in the Xenoblade Chronicles 3 video that a lot of Monolith Soft games to me are about like having a little bit of trouble following what's happening, and how how Endless Frontier handles that, I think it's largely through visual aspects. So in replaying that, I think it just solidified my opinion on that. I think I probably move it above Xenosaga Episode 1 here. Xenosaga Episode 1, in replaying what little I did, I will say, I did not play a lot of it. I remember the slot machine mechanic being like a really cool aspect of this game, where like the battle conditions change each turn. And I appreciate this game for adding that in, initially here. There's nothing like that in Xenogears as far as I can recall, at least. So I appreciate that, but in putting it right here, I think this is probably a good spot for it. I just think the battle system, from what little I interacted with it, maybe did not excite me as much as I was hoping it would. But it could also be that, like, in playing some of these other games, that my feelings about those games' battle systems were elevated a little bit more in revisiting them. So we're moving Xenosaga Episode 1 down a little bit more. Still, I'd say a B rank game. I think it's in that range at least. Baten Kaitos Origins. So I think I have come away a lot more positive about this game. Whether the ranking will move is another thing. In replaying it, I really respect its battle system. I think in my memory, the battle system for Baten Kaitos Origins specifically was a little more similar to the original Baten Kaitos, but in returning to it, it's actually very different. There are some weird pacing issues with Baten Kaitos Origins specifically, but the battle system, I think, is, for the most part, maybe in the way that like a Xenoblade Chronicles X feels like a fairly unique thing with it. So, I think my big concern about Baten Kaitos Origins, though, is maybe the world design specifically, because in revisiting some of the world areas in that game, I really noticed that they did not feel nearly as satisfying to revisit as the original Baten Kaitos. However, I did not really go deep into them. So I think my fear in moving it right now is, the reason I'd be moving it is because I did not really find what I was looking for in the dungeon design, but I did not heavily invest in re-exploring those for this thing. So I think, honestly, I probably could interchange these two. And if I were to replay Baten Kaitos Origins and find that I did not care so much for what was going on in the dungeon designs, I think it would very much move to like right here kind of thing, where it's like, to the right, essentially. But in this particular case, I think I'm going to leave it just because I'm a little uncertain, and I think I personally prefer where Baten Kaitos Origins goes with its battle system. I think it does set itself a little bit further apart than Xenoblade Chronicles does to Xenoblade Chronicles X, but I did really like the feel of the game a lot in playing it. Which I enjoyed. Xenoblade Chronicles 2. This is at the A rank. I forget what I said about this last time. I hope in reiterating this, I don't want to go into too much detail because I already talked a lot about this. But I remember for Xenoblade Chronicles 2, I think what I really came away with Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is that, I kind of don't like most things about the game outside of the characters and the combat system. But I think the characters and combat system, well, certain characters, I should say. I think there are other characters like Pyra or something like that who is not really well elaborated on. But the combat system in this game, I think, is fantastic. I think the world design's a little weak, though. But I'm gonna leave it here at the A rank. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, I think it is. I think the combat system alone elevates it to the degree it elevates it there. I think the world design is a little weak, but I really think this game sets itself apart in a way from both Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and Xenoblade Chronicles X that I really enjoyed. So I'm gonna leave that there at the A rank there. Xenosaga Episode 2. I had a great time replaying this. I know people do not agree with me about Xenosaga Episode 2. I was replaying the areas. I felt like the dungeon design was pretty solid from what I could revisit through just a cleared save file. I thought the battle system was a huge improvement over what I revisited in Xenosaga Episode 1, and it felt like it really was starting to get into more of the modern kind of post-Baten Kaitos combat design of Monolith Soft that I really, really appreciate. I feel like they kind of brought some of those elements back into Xenosaga Episode 2, even though the person who worked on the battle system, people who worked on the battle system, and were credited at least, were not necessarily the same people. But I feel like Xenosaga Episode 2 feels more like a Baten Kaitos game in some way than it does like a Xenosaga game, weirdly enough. So I still put that at the A rank. You know, obviously there's other issues with that game that people have. I would need to revisit it to see how the story and pacing is. I'm not opposed to like a 15 to 20 hour RPG, which is what Xenosaga Episode 2 is, but I can't really remember how it was paced out and how it was dealt with. If it felt like really out of place or if it felt like a nice compact story. We're up at the S tier now. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Torna the Golden Country. I think this game has slowly increased, like, I think I've slowly gained more respect for this game in a lot of ways. It's weird because, like, when you think about what I talk about in the Xenoblade Chronicles 3 video, if you didn't watch that, it's basically, you know, I think unique combat design and world design is very important in Monolith Soft games. I feel like Torna doesn't have nearly as much as a lot of these other games, but the fact that it does it as, like, a extra pass of content, like, it's not, like, technically its own full game, right, but it is its own standalone thing. I think I'm really impressed by it. Also, I think the rev up of that game is really fast. Like, that game gets you going really, really fast. And I think that's something that every Xenoblade Chronicles game can learn from. I think this one's gonna maybe move over and overtake Xenoblade Chronicles 1. I think that's just how I feel right now, kind of thing, right? And I think it's just kind of that growing appreciation for it. And just like thinking, especially after playing Xenoblade Chronicles 3 and seeing what Torna did better than 3 in some ways, I think I respect it a bit more now. Xenoblade Chronicles 1, I moved it down here a little bit. I don't think there's anything to be said about the quality of the game. If anything, I feel like my opinion of Xenoblade Chronicles 1 has actually increased a little bit, specifically when it comes to world design, because in walking around those worlds, like, you really feel being on the giants in a way you don't really get out of the other Xenoblade games, I feel like. I know some people feel that way with Xenoblade Chronicles 2. I don't know if it's just because of the abstract nature of the things you're on versus, like, a humanoid body, but I really didn't get that feeling from Xenoblade Chronicles 2. I think there's other design issues with Xenoblade Chronicles 2 when it comes to area design as well, but we're talking about this kind of overarching concept. And I think that helps contribute to the variety of areas in Xenoblade Chronicles 1. Also, even setting the giant aside, I think there's a lot of different map styles in Xenoblade Chronicles 1, which I really appreciate. And I feel like the areas feel a lot more fun to find in that game, because it feels like every area is doing something a little bit different. And in replaying a little bit of Xenoblade Chronicles 1, I kind of realized I don't necessarily think that's the case for other Xenoblade games. I think Torna gets down certain aspects of this. I think in my Torna review, I think I say it more or less recaptures it, but I think what it loses is that it does lose the more distinct area designs based off the body parts you're on. And then Baten Kaitos, number 1. I think I still feel this way. I went back and watched some footage recently. Wow, that voice acting sure is recorded poorly. But I really love replaying that game. I love the complexity of its combat system. And I honestly think Baten Kaitos, to me, is kind of like the, in some ways, quintessential Monolith Soft title as a whole. So largely going to keep it all the same there. So we shifted some things around. Hopefully that all makes sense. I have not, in the time that we have last talked, played Project Crossroad 2, Dragon Ball Z, Attack of the Saiyans, Xenosaga Freaks. I do own a copy of Xenosaga Freaks. I do own all the DS games except for the DBZ one. I'm missing that one. I plan to play Somabringer sometime soon. Xseed, Xenosaga 1 and 2. I think there might be a fan translation in the work for that. Xseed has a fan translation. All right, here's the moment of truth. So Xenoblade Chronicles 3. If you didn't watch my video, in the literal thumbnail of the video, I say, hey, this is, to me, the most underwhelming Xenosaga, or Xenoblade Chronicles game. I explain all my points in the video, so if you haven't seen it, you should go watch that. We'll probably touch on some of those points today here when we talk about it. I have not thought a lot about this, I will say. I've done some gut feelings about this when people ask me about it, but I have not really sat down and thought about this. So you're getting this somewhat raw. I mean, obviously I've been thinking about the game, right? But where it's going to be placed, I don't know yet. So I can say fairly certain, like, what makes an S-tier Monolith Soft game for me? And I think I really need to be surprised by a game usually. I think it needs to really establish really cool new mechanics. I think that's something Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and Baten Kaitos really do. Again, Torna, I think I evaluate on a different level, although I was really blown away by what they did, given that. So I think it doesn't really fit the S tier, because my feelings on Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is that it feels very steeped within Xenoblade Chronicles past. That is something that may be very intentional. The game is literally about Xenoblade Chronicles 1 and Xenoblade Chronicles 2's like world designs coming together. From the beginning, one army is like shaped as the like robots for them are the Mechon. I think that's what they're called. It's been a little bit, sorry. I think they're called the Mechon. And then also on the other side, they have very like Xenoblade Chronicles 2 aesthetic gear and armor and things like that. In the whole game, more and more of that stuff happens with, the two characters on the separate sides representing the two different worlds and things like that. Like, they build in the fact that the two worlds are coming together in, like, every aspect of the game. The key point I try to make in the video, though, I think, is that, I don't feel like that creates something new. I think you can combine things in games and create something new. In this case, I do not think it did that. It's definitely new, but I think the ultimate feeling of it is very samey as the past games. So I don't think it makes the S tier. On the A tier, these are games that have problems, and in the case of the two games here, my love for them is mostly very combat focused. And so I think what A kind of represents in some ways with this is that it does at least one thing ridiculously well, in my opinion, or at least it very much satisfied me in a lot of ways. In some ways, I think you might be able to consider Xenoblade Chronicles X in here. I think there are maybe bigger problems that Xenoblade Chronicles X has that limits not only, it's not like Xenoblade Chronicles 2 where I feel like parts of the game are literally abrasive towards the player, but I think the mechanics that work well despite that. Where I feel like Xenoblade Chronicles X at times is hurt by some of those elements, even in the places that it is strong already. So I think we're going to keep that layout there, but I think that probably makes sense. And I think nothing in Xenoblade Chronicles 3 stands out to me as like the one singular thing that it does particularly well. I think there's something to be said about the story aspect of the game, being very conservative in a way that I personally appreciate. If you listen to my last version of this, I was pretty hard on the Xenogears, Xenosaga, expanded universe kind of thing. I don't really care about it, but in after that podcast and really thinking about how I was talking about combat and world design versus story, I realized for some people, my combat and world design is their story, and they want Xenoblade Chronicles or Monolith Soft and Xeno as a franchise to push those limits. And their most recent games are not really doing that. I think Xenoblade Chronicles 2 reaches for it, but does not grab it. It just says, hey, I might do this, and doesn't actually do it. So I think there's something to be said about, maybe one day they can successfully implement something like that. But personally, I'm very happy with where the story is. But I don't really view Monolith Soft stories as anything special personally. Like, I feel like they're very decent to good, and sometimes, decent to good, and sometimes great, maybe, story lines. So I don't think story particularly elevates this game. I think there's a lot of improvements in the writing and stuff, but none of it that's like, wow. It is like, this is better, but none of it's like, whoa, I'm being blown away by this at this moment. So I think A really required me to be blown away by one particular thing, and I don't necessarily know if that is something that Xenoblade Chronicles 3 has done for me. The B rank. So I feel like around here is where we're thinking about, like, this is probably realistically when I can start thinking about actually placing Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Because we are kind of in that space that I think, we have a game like Baten Kaitos Origins, which I think suffers in a lot of the same way that Xenoblade Chronicles 3 suffers. I think it excels in certain ways that 3 doesn't, but I think they are in a very similar realm. Where they are reiterating on a lot of ideas. However, I feel like Xenoblade Baten Kaitos Origins finds some success in reiterating on some of those ideas. Where I feel like Xenoblade Chronicles 3 ultimately makes great systems and mechanics and world elements, or at least good, right? But doesn't find anything that really jumps out at me. Where I think in revisiting Baten Kaitos Origins, I think that battle system, while very iterative, is a really fun thing to work with, and it is something that I think is very distinguished, or it feels very different to play than the original Baten Kaitos, even though they do kind of have a lot of the same lifeblood in some ways with that. So it's not going to go above Baten Kaitos Origins, I'm pretty sure. Xenoblade Chronicles X, again, I think the world design structure of Xenoblade Chronicles X is very strong. I think there's a lot to be said about combat as well. So I think there are elements of Xenoblade Chronicles X that elevate that game for me in a way that I don't really feel like Xenoblade Chronicles 3 has. So it's going to go below Xenoblade Chronicles X. Here's where things start getting a little dicey. Super Robot Tyson, OG Saga, Endless Frontier. So the Endless Frontier game, you know, the people who are working on these games are not always just the typical Monolith Soft crew. It's hard to say, you know, how involved these people are in between projects. Like, something about Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is that the typical lead battle system designer, who was pre-Xenoblade Chronicles 2, seemingly the lead on a lot of battle systems for the Xeno franchise, no longer is actually on that battle system design team, or at least he's not credited on such. But I fully expect, he's still at the company, he's working on UI stuff, I fully expect he is still being, you know, talked to about that stuff to some degree, right? I would just imagine so, how companies work. So, like, it's something that, like, I think there's always kind of some bleed over here. Obviously, Crescendo has an involvement in Baten Kaitos as well. But Endless Frontier, to me, establishes a lot of its interesting, like, mechanics in a very different way, because I feel like it's a very simple game overall. You know, you're largely just tapping the A button to juggle enemies, and the key components there are canceling attacks and then timing your attacks at certain times. And so you're watching, like, this flurry of stuff happening, and timing it is very important. And I think that combat system, while maybe doesn't have the depth of most of the games above it on this list, maybe all of those games, it does give me that feeling. It feels like a Monolith Soft game in that way. And I think the combat system is very fun to use, and fun to utilize. I will say, I've never played Namco x Capcom. I don't know how similar those games are. So personally, I'm giving Endless Frontier a lot of credit for this, where maybe Namco x Capcom or Cross Capcom deserves more. But I have not played that game yet. I think that also has a fan translation, so at some point. So I do not think Xenoblade Chronicles 3 beats Super Robot Tyson, OG Saga, Endless Frontier. Xenosaga Episode 1. I think if this was before, on my last list, Saga 1 may have stayed higher up and would maybe have surpassed Xenoblade Chronicles 3. I think this is where this might be where this ends up. I feel like my faith in Saga 1 has been shaken a little bit after revisiting it a little bit. However, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is definitely a better game than Xenosaga Episode 1. But I do think the battle condition system in Xenoblade Chronicles 1 I think it is a good thing, and then at the time when I was first interacting with it, it was a very distinct aspect of that combat system. I think the reason why it maybe does not feel as satisfying now is because I went and played Xenosaga Episode 2, and that game includes that system and then builds on top of it. This is something I've talked about before, where unfortunately, I feel like this happens with a lot of games where, me personally, when games are building on top of themselves over and over and over again, the original game starts becoming more and more difficult for me to kind of praise as much. I think like A Link to the Past is a great example of this, or Castlevania Symphony of the Night. They're great games, and they are, if they're like on their own, if they were just released within just their own thing, I think they're amazing games. But when you have this iteration upon iteration upon iteration that does different things, makes improvements, you know, it's harder to find the game, the unique things about that original game if it's used as the foundation for every one of those games. And I think in some ways that's what I try to get at in the Xenoblade Chronicles 3 video. So here's a question, and this is something I don't think I answered in my Xenoblade Chronicles 3 video, which I think is something that I should have answered, but you know, you're throwing this, like, you have a month to play a 100-hour RPG, throw a script together and edit a video. I tried my best, you know. I'm pretty happy with the video, how it turned out. There are definitely things that I worry about. But the question I never really wrapped back to was, is Xenoblade Chronicles 3, does it feel like a Monolith Soft game in the aspect of how I defined the battle systems of that franchise, right? and how I define the world. I think it's pretty easy for me to say the world is fine. It feels like a Xenoblade game. And so inherently, I think it does carry some of that legacy already. I'm going to throw that to the side. I think the world design is just kind of boring in that game. It's fine. It's good. It gets the point across. You go through the video game. It gives you places to walk and explore. I just don't think it like does anything super exciting. So it really kind of comes down to combat. And how I define combat as in a Xenoblade Chronicles game to me in that video was it was something that was, difficult to control, but you still have some control, right? You're managing a bunch of mechanics. And you're putting things together as you can, and then executing when things fall into your hands, right? Usually something out of your hand in some ways. And to some degree, I think there's something to be said about Ouroboros, and lining up with your AI companions. It also has the break topple system and things like that. So some of those are brought in from previous Xenoblade games. So that element's still there. But out of the new elements, let's focus on the new elements though. The Ouroboros. There is actually a toggle in the game where you can control your companion's Ouroboros speeders, or rather how they utilize their Ouroboros. So you can make them all level 3 if you want to. I did not play with that on because I felt like it kind of messed with some of the my I don't know. I kind of feel like now in finishing that game, I wish I had left it on. I think I kind of felt like, well, this is the way it was left by the developer, so maybe I should just focus on this, because it's not something they point out to you and say, hey, try this out. It's just in the options if you want to do it, where you can control all your party when they go Ouroboros. And I feel like that's probably maybe one thing that I probably would have enjoyed more if I had turned it on. But I don't feel like the Ouroboros is something like a mechanic of the game that really is kind of out of your control. I kind of come back that I think Ouroboros falls within the mech combat aspect of Xenogames, and I think the mech combat aspect of Xenogames are largely fairly weak. I think there's a lot to be said about Xenoblade Chronicles X's maybe. Like there's things that are going on there, but largely I think most mech implementations in Xenogames is not as fun as the core combat system. It is definitely better to use, which kind of frustrates me because I would rather not use them most of the time. Mechs are very cool in Endless Frontier, I will say, but they're not really mechs. I mean, they're mechs, but they're not handled in the traditional way. So I don't think Ouroboros does this for me. So I think if we were just considering Ouroboros, I'm going to put it below Xenosaga Episode 1. We got the Master Arts / Fusion Arts thing. I know I only called them Fusion Arts in the video. It made things easier to just do that rather than sit there and go like Master Arts versus Talent Arts versus Fusion Arts. I mean, yeah. Fusion Arts. I think if there's one thing that Fusion Arts did, and I didn't touch on this video really. I mean, I did talk about it. I think I said there are considerations you make. There's a pacing difference between using Fusion Arts in this game versus other games and how you perform actions, because you have to sometimes think about, do I want to save up for the Fusion Arts? Actually, it kind of in some ways feels like Xenoblade Chronicles X's double cooldown, right? So it might match that a little bit in some ways. I don't know if it really I don't think it really matches what I want though from that, because I think about the element of it's something you manage. It is a piece that you manage in the game. I feel like really what I'm trying to get to here is that there's not an outside element in this game. I feel like there's that piece that you're like the one I mentioned in the video that's like, hey, there are these elements outside that kind of dictate when you take actions in a game. Whether that be, the combo system in how AI companions respond, how cards fall in your hand in Baten Kaitos, or how, the roulette wheel changes in a Xenosaga game. I think what I'm really getting at, too, is I don't feel like there's something like that in this game. Obviously, there's the break topple combo, or the break topple launch combo stuff in this game still. That's there. But that's not, that's in every Xeno game. That's in Xenosaga Episode 2. I'm not going to credit this game with that as like a, unique, interesting thing that this game does. Yeah, I think this is pushing it down. Ooh, boy. So the question is it in the B rank? I think I'm gonna put it below Xenosaga Episode 1. Is it B rank, though? Once we get down to C, things get weird. We got Disaster Day of Crisis, a game that I think ultimately fails in its execution of what I want it to be. I love Disaster Day Crisis, don't get me wrong. You saw in the video, I have a Disaster Day Crisis poster on my wall. I have a lot of love for this game. But when I think about it as like a Wii game, we're talking about a different criteria here now at this point, but let's talk about this game seriously in a way. When I think about Disaster Day Crisis as a Wii game, I don't think it is a great Wii game entirely. I think when I think of Wii games that really succeed, they're Wii games that give impact to the motion controls in games. And Disaster Day of Crisis has some moments. It, with like, you know, running away from like the tsunamis and things like that, right? But there's a lot of other stuff in that game that does not feel that way. Especially rescuing other citizens, I feel like they feel like very tedious, not worth like looking at motions in the game. The shooting is good. The shooting's fine. It could be better. There's a good weapon variety in it though. I'm going to set Disaster Day of Crisis aside for now just because it's such a weird comparison to make, right? Because it's kind of a completely different thing. Let's just look at Xenogears here. We'll think about Disaster Day of Crisis and where Xenoblade will go with that. Xenogears. Okay, Xenogears. I don't have a lot of personal respect for Xenogears. I seem to recall when we talked about this last time, I was going to put it at the D rank, but ended up elevating it because I feel like there is a lot to say about what Xenogears did for the Western market and cult kind of JRPG status games, right? Like, there's a lot going on in Xenogears story-wise that while I personally don't like love, I think a lot of Western JRPG fans were really getting that kind of essence in this game for the first time. And I specify Western because, you know, it's very easy for us to get focused on what happened in the US, but, you know, there are tons of JRPGs coming out in Japan that were, you know, entirely, you know, untranslated, and obviously in the context of someone like me at least, I don't know what a lot of those are. So I want to be careful about that kind of stuff. But Western specific, I think this game did a lot for storytelling and JRPGs, or at least introduced a lot of that stuff to a Western market. I think I might feel very similar, though, to Xenoblade Chronicles 3 in that regard. Like, I've got a lot of respect for Xenoblade Chronicles 3 and what it does story-wise, even if I don't personally, like, love it. I mean, I do like it, but I don't, like, love it. I do have a respect for what it does. So I think those kind of null out for me. So let's talk about combat. World design, I don't remember enough about Xenogears. I remember being very traditional kind of PlayStation 1 era JRPG in world design, outside of, obviously, Disc 2 and the nightmare that happens there. So let's talk about combat. Again, it's been a very long time since I played Xenogears, and I did not play it for this video. When I think about combat, personally, I feel like Xenogears is not quite, you know, obviously this is not a Monolith Soft game per se, it's just some of the people that are on board. The guy who worked on the Xeno battle systems eventually did work on this and then worked on the other ones later. There's definitely trying for something in the battle system here. I can't necessarily personally say like how unique it was versus other PlayStation RPGs. I feel like you have like games like Legend of Legaia, I think, where they have like button input for like combos and things like that. And I feel like Gears hit something very similar there. There's a nice bit of variety though with the mech kind of stuff. I feel like there's like some mini games in there if I recall correctly. But personally, I said let's set the story aside, but I do think, okay, I guess we're getting into story again. I do think Xenogears is a failed game as a story, though. That is a game that does not have a satisfying conclusion. I know some people like it, and I know there are some opinions on it that say people prefer it because it focuses the story. To me, it just really reads as we ran out of budget and we have to fast track this game, and it kind of de-emphasizes and minimizes certain events. You get in the giant mech at the end and it just feels like nothing because you're just like dropped in it and you're like, oh, what's happening? You read like a paragraph of text beforehand and now it's like, okay, mech fight, robots are dead, go to the next dungeon kind of thing. So I think I am going to dock Xenogears for that. And I think I don't feel passionately enough about Xenogears' combat system to elevate it any higher as well. So I think Xenoblade Chronicles 3 for sure is going to be in the C rank. I think this is similar to how I feel about Xenogears in a lot of ways, but I think we're just talking about specifics now. So I'm going to stick it right here. This is not its final spot. So the real question and the hardest one is, does it elevate above Disaster Day of Crisis? You know, I just had a thought about Disaster Day of Crisis of, it's a game that I think does a lot of what other games are doing, but it contextualizes them all in very interesting ways with in a way that is all interconnected because it is disaster focused, right? So you're doing a lot of different things, and the way they all connect is through the disasters themselves. And I kind of think that's something I can kind of respect. Even though I feel like a lot of the mini games are underwhelming to play, I feel like a lot of them could have been reworked and thrown away or done in different ways to make them more exciting. I think the on-rail shooting could have been better. I think I can respect that. Is that enough to put Xenoblade Chronicles 3 below it? I don't know yet. Let me think about characters. We didn't talk about characters much in Disaster Day of Crisis. It is very like B-movie action kind of thing, for sure. If you play the Japanese version of Disaster Day of Crisis, I personally think the writing is worse there, and not in a like funnier worse kind of way. I just think it is slightly worse. I made a video about that if you didn't see it. And I think the European version is only an improvement. I do think it's kind of interesting that Major Evans, the hit Monolith Soft character, Major Evans, he is kind of, in a lot of ways, just thinking about this, he's kind of like a lot of the villains in the Monolith Soft games. He's kind of like somewhat psychotic. Does that come from a place? I guess the difference is like, it doesn't really come from somewhere though, I think. I think Major Evans is crazy just to be crazy for the most part. He literally just gets off on natural disasters happening to him. And that is his thing. It's like somebody who like will actively go if there's gonna be like a hurricane and be like, I'm going there and I got my bug out bag and I'm gonna survive kind of thing, right? Yeah. Huh. I personally, when it comes to my favorite games, I'm gonna remember Disaster Day of Crisis more fondly than Xenoblade Chronicles 3. It's a very emotional feeling. I don't think that's like set up in or created from, a series of factual pieces here. I think it is very much my personal experience with the Wii, what I wanted Disaster Day of Crisis to be, the vision of that game, even though it failed to meet that. I do respect that at the very least. And in some ways, I will say, it is kind of like my first real Monolith game where like I knew what was going on with the developer, because I played Baten, Kaitos, and the Xeno games before, but I didn't know who made them. And Disaster Day of Crisis was like one of the first times I looked at the developer and was like, who's Monolith Soft? And I was like, oh, I've played their games before, but Disaster is obviously a very different thing. But the quality of Xenoblade Chronicles 3 overall, I think, is really good. There is no game below Xenoblade Chronicles 3 on this list that I think meets that standard. None of these games just are good games to just be good games. They all have major faults. And I feel like Xenoblade Chronicles 3 has no major fault beyond just not going the extra mile in the way I think all these games above it do. And I think that's at somewhat odds of Disaster Day of Crisis. However, I think Disaster Day of Crisis... Look, okay. If you don't agree with my sentiment about Disaster Day of Crisis, I'm going to say this. This is your list. Do that. Feel good about it. I'm putting Disaster Day of Crisis above Xenoblade Chronicles 3. I personally think that that is not necessarily based in any super strong logic. I mean, we're already cutting hairs or whatever. We're already cutting it really close here. We're in the C rank, just deciding where it lines up on this list. But personally, I know I'm going to remember Disaster Day of Crisis more fondly than I'll remember Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Maybe that's a time and place thing. I think for me, it's more of what that game represents as a Wii game and what it failed to do, but I think tried to do. And the concept of what this game was, I think really fit the Wii very well. I think there are execution issues in this game, but the general concept's very good. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is a very good game and is well-rounded, and I think it does everything it tries to do very well. But when I sit down and think about what defines this game, what's going to make this game be something I remember and look back on, I do not know what that is. I think it is just Xenoblade Chronicles Vanilla Edition in some ways. So, in saying that, I think this is our final list. It beat out Xenogears. The rest of those games I have very negative opinions. I mean, I kind of don't have a great opinion of Xenogears either. Yeah. Alright, well, hopefully I explained my thought process well enough. I know some people aren't going to agree, but hey, Tier Maker, I had to update this because nobody had made a Xenosaga or Xenoblade Chronicles 3 equipped Tier Maker, so I had to make my own. I'll include the link if you want to do your own. I will say I just threw these pictures in here, so they're not exactly all lined up. We got PlayStation logos, DS logos, 3DS logos, all that stuff. Personally, I think I'm going to play Somabringer next. I really want to play that. There's a fan translation. You should definitely do that. I think, I don't know what I would do after that, but I'm thinking maybe Xseed, but I also think I would like to maybe get Dragon Ball Z, because I feel like Xseed, I'm setting myself up for disappointment, because I imagine Xseed is going to feel very similar to Endless Frontier here. I do not want to play Project Cross Zone 2 kind of ever. I think Project Cross Zone has spoiled me in a way that I don't feel great about Namco Cross Capcom, but I am willing to play it. Xenosaga Episode 1 and 2, I think at this point I'm going to leave as I think it is a game that would probably really satisfy me. I hear the combat system's really cool in it, but I think I'm going to wait and see if that fan translation finishes up, because I have other things I could be doing with Monolith Soft, Somabringer particularly. So if I get desperate, this might move up here, but for now I think these three games are probably going to be the next games I play. When I'll play them, I don't know, but Somabringer, hopefully sooner rather than later. Anyways, thank you for joining me on this. It did take a while. Apologize if you were expecting this to be a quick thing, but I did want to kind of go back and refresh my list here based off, some new thoughts and feelings I had after revisiting some of these games. And also Xenoblade Chronicles 3 changing some of my perspective on things like Torna, the Golden Country. So, anyways, that's it for this week. Thank you again for coming. If you did not watch the original ranking video, you can do so on, it's a podcast. I'll link that at the end, I'm sure. I put out the Xenoblade Chronicles 3 video. I talk about world structure and combat design, mostly, and I kind of go into more detail about, what my problems are, more system by system in that game. So if you haven't watched that yet, go check that out. Otherwise, I have a general playlist where I'm putting all my Monolith Soft and Xenoblade content, so if you want to keep track of what's going on, I don't plan to put out a ton of stuff in the short term. It's probably the last thing that's going to be there until I do something with Somabringer, probably. But, all that stuff is there if you're interested. On the Patreon, though, I do article readings, and a lot of my old Monolith Soft stuff are written articles on my website, onecontrolboard.com. So if you want to hear me verbally communicate what those articles are saying and also do some like post reflection on what I said and how I feel today, I do include some of that stuff on the Patreon. I have a free one for Xenoblade Chronicles 1 as well if you want to check that out. Otherwise, thank you guys again so much for coming. onecontrolboard.com is the website, and I hope you have a great week. Bye!